The sky was painted in soft orange and gold that evening as the sun sank behind the trees. The air smelled of wet grass and the sound of the river flowed quietly through the valley. Near that river lived a little orphan girl. She had no family, no real home, and no one to call her own. She slept in a tiny shed behind a baker's shop, on a pile of hay that she had gathered herself. Every morning she worked hard just to earn a bit of bread or a few coins. Some people in the village pitied her, but most barely noticed her. She was small, thin, and always quiet. Her clothes were worn and patched, her shoes almost torn through. Yet there was something about her that made people pause when they looked closely. An honesty in her eyes, a kind of gentle courage that couldn't be hidden under dirt or rags. In the evenings, when her work was done, she would walk down to the river. It was the one place where she could be alone, away from the noise of the marketplace and the cold stares of strangers. She liked the sound of the water and the feeling of the cool sand under her feet. Sometimes she would talk softly to herself or to the small fish that darted through the clear water. That evening the wind was calm. She was sitting on a flat rock by the river, her bare feet in the water, watching the sunset fade into the first pale light of night. She thought about her mother and father, faces she could hardly remember now. She wondered where they might be, or if they were watching her from somewhere she couldn't see. The world felt large and empty. Still, the river gave her peace. Just as she was about to rise and fill her bucket, she noticed something moving on the far side of the river. At first she thought it was a deer coming down for a drink, but then she saw a small figure, someone trying to walk along the rocky edge. The person stumbled, caught their balance, and then almost fell again. She squinted through the fading light. It was another girl, around her own age, but she walked with a limp. Her dress looked torn and her hair hung wet over her shoulders. She was carrying a small bundle in one arm and trying to keep her balance as the water rushed past her legs. The orphan stood frozen for a moment. She had never seen anyone on that side of the river at this hour. That side led to the forest, deep, dark, and often spoken of with fear. The villagers said that was where the native tribes lived, the people who rarely came near the settlement. The girl across the river looked scared and tired. She slipped again, almost dropping her bundle. The orphan's heart pounded. She didn't know what to do, whether to hide, call for help, or go closer. Then she heard a small cry, thin and frightened. It wasn't loud, but it broke through the soft sound of the water like a bell. Without thinking, the orphan stepped forward. The river wasn't deep in this season, but the current was strong enough to make her hesitate. She looked around, no one was near. The village was far behind her. "Wait," she called softly across the water. "Don't move." The girl looked up, startled, her eyes wide. The orphan could see now how pale her face was, how she held her leg awkwardly as if it hurt to stand. The orphan set down her bucket and stepped into the river. The cold bit into her legs at once, but she kept going. The water reached her knees, then her waist. She struggled to keep her footing as the current pushed against her, but she kept her eyes fixed on the girl. The girl tried to step closer too, but her injured leg gave way. She stumbled and fell, clutching the bundle to her chest. The orphan lunged forward, the cold shocking her body, and grabbed the girl's arm before the river could carry her away. For a moment, they both struggled in the water, their breaths quick and heavy. Then, little by little, the orphan pulled her toward the shallow bank. When they reached the shore, both of them were soaked and shivering. The orphan helped her sit down on the sand, gasping for breath. "Are you hurt?" she asked, still panting. The other girl nodded weakly, trying to smile. Her foot was bleeding. A deep cut ran along the bottom of her heel, and the water had made it worse. The orphan didn't know much about wounds, but she knew she couldn't leave her there. She tore a strip from her skirt and wrapped it around the girl's foot, tying it tightly to stop the bleeding. The girl watched her, eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. She spoke softly, but her words were not clear at first. The orphan realized she was speaking in a different tongue, though she caught a few words in between, words like hurt and home. The orphan smiled gently. "It's okay," she said slowly and softly. "You're safe now." The girl didn't reply, but the fear in her eyes began to fade. The orphan looked toward the village, then back to the forest. She knew she couldn't bring the girl into the village. The townsfolk were quick to judge, and they feared anything or anyone from the forest side. They would never listen, she thought quickly. There was an old barn near the edge of the fields, long abandoned. It wasn't far from the river. She could take her there for the night, at least until morning. "Can you walk?" she asked. The girl tried but winced in pain. So the orphan bent down, lifted the bundle, and helped her to her feet. The limp was worse than she thought, so she let the girl lean on her shoulder. Step by step, they moved through the damp grass toward the old barn. The moon had risen by the time they reached it. The place smelled of dry hay and dust. The orphan led the girl to a corner where the ground was soft and spread some hay for her to sit on. She found an old tin lantern, lit it with the last match she had, and set it nearby. The soft glow filled the barn, throwing shadows across the wooden walls. The girl looked exhausted. The orphan took her small bundle. It was just a few pieces of cloth and a small beaded necklace, and placed it gently beside her. Then she handed over a piece of bread she had saved from earlier that day. The girl hesitated, but hunger won. She ate slowly, looking up once in a while with silent gratitude. The orphan smiled faintly. "You rest," she said. "I'll watch." The girl lay down, her eyes half closed, murmuring something in her own language. It sounded like a prayer or maybe a word of thanks. The orphan sat quietly beside her. The sound of the river carried faintly through the open cracks in the wall. She wondered who the girl was, where she came from, and what had happened to make her cross the river alone and hurt. But she didn't ask. It didn't matter right now. What mattered was that she was safe. As the night deepened, the orphan felt a strange warmth inside her. It wasn't from the lantern, it was something deeper. For so long, no one had needed her. No one had looked at her as if she mattered. But now here was someone who did. Someone she had saved. She thought about how scared the girl must have been, trying to cross the cold river all by herself. Maybe she too was lost or running from something. Maybe she had no one to help her, just like the orphan herself. For the first time in years, the orphan didn't feel completely alone. She looked at the sleeping girl and whispered, "You'll be okay now. I promise." Outside, the wind rustled softly through the grass. The moonlight crept across the barn floor, touching their faces with a pale glow. The orphan leaned back against the wall, tired but peaceful. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know who the girl really was or what danger might be following her. But in that quiet moment, none of it mattered. Two lonely souls had found each other beside a river that separated worlds, and somehow it felt like fate. The orphan closed her eyes, listening to the gentle breathing of the girl beside her, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled before drifting to sleep. The morning light filtered through the broken slats of the barn, painting thin golden lines across the hay-covered floor. The orphan opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the brightness. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she turned her head and saw the other girl still sleeping beside her, curled up under the old cloth she had used as a blanket. The orphan sat up quietly, careful not to wake her. The air was cool and the smell of damp grass came through the cracks in the wall. Outside, birds were calling to one another, and the sound of the river whispered faintly in the distance. It felt peaceful, almost safe. The girl's face looked softer in the daylight. Her skin was a little darker than the orphan's, her hair long and dark like river reeds, and her lips slightly cracked from thirst. Her foot was still wrapped in the piece of cloth the orphan had tied the night before. The blood had dried and the wound seemed clean. The orphan got up and quietly stepped outside. She needed water and something to eat before the girl woke. The path to the river was short, and the grass was still wet with dew. As she filled her tin cup, she saw her own reflection in the water, messy hair, tired eyes, and a faint smile she didn't notice at first. When she came back, the girl was awake. She was sitting up, her eyes wide and alert, holding her bundle tightly against her chest. For a second, she looked frightened, as if she had forgotten where she was. "It's all right," the orphan said softly, setting the cup down near her. "You're safe. You can drink." The girl hesitated, but then took the cup with both hands. She drank slowly, her fingers trembling. The orphan smiled gently. "Better?" The girl nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice low and unsure, as if she was still learning the word. That small word made the orphan's heart lift. She sat beside her, tearing a piece of stale bread in half and offering one piece to her. The girl accepted it with a small smile, whispering something that sounded like thanks. They ate in silence for a while. Then the orphan pointed to the girl's foot. "Does it hurt?" she asked. The girl looked down, then nodded. "A little." "I can clean it again," the orphan said. She took out her small piece of cloth, dipped it in the water, and began to wipe the wound gently. The girl flinched at first, but then relaxed, watching the orphan's careful hands. After a while, the girl tried to speak again. Her accent was heavy, her words broken but clear enough. "You help me." "Why?" The orphan looked up at her and shrugged. "You needed help." The girl seemed to think about that. She tilted her head, studying the orphan's face as if trying to understand her. Then she smiled faintly. "Kind girl," she said quietly. The orphan didn't know what to say. No one had ever called her kind before. People in the village only saw her as the poor orphan who swept floors and ran errands. To be called kind, it felt strange but warm. The girl's name, she learned, was something that sounded soft and flowing, a name from her tribe. The orphan couldn't pronounce it well, but she tried. The girl laughed quietly when she did, her laughter light and musical. All day they stayed inside the barn. The orphan didn't want anyone in the village to see her guest. People would not understand. They would think the worst, as they always did. To them, the tribes across the river were not neighbors, but strangers to be feared. When the sun rose higher, the orphan sneaked out again to find food. She went to the baker's shop where she sometimes worked, sweeping the floor and washing trays. The baker was too busy to notice her slip a small piece of bread and an apple into her pocket. Her hands trembled with guilt, but she told herself she would pay him back one day. Back at the barn, the girl was sitting by the lantern, tracing lines in the dust with her finger. When she saw the orphan return, her face brightened. They shared the bread and the apple, taking small bites to make it last longer. After they ate, the girl took something from her bundle, a small necklace made of wooden beads and a carved bone pendant. She held it out to the orphan. "For you," she said softly. The orphan shook her head. "No, that's yours." The girl pressed it into her hand. "You saved me. You kind. You keep." The orphan looked down at the necklace. The beads were smooth and warm from the girl's hands. She had never been given anything before, not even on her birthday if she still had one. She felt tears sting her eyes but quickly blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, the sky turned purple and gold again. The two girls sat outside the barn, watching the sunset together. The air was cool and fireflies began to glow over the fields. The girl pointed toward the forest on the far side of the river. She spoke softly in short words that the orphan could understand only partly. She said her home was there, deep inside those trees, near the hills. She had been gathering berries when she hurt her foot and got lost. Then the rain came and the river grew high and she couldn't cross back. The orphan listened quietly. She didn't ask too many questions, but she could tell the girl missed her people. Every now and then, she would look toward the trees, her eyes distant, her face full of longing. When darkness fell, they went back inside. The orphan lit the lantern again, and the two girls sat close, their shadows moving softly against the walls. The orphan told her small stories, how she used to watch the river fish sparkle in the moonlight, how the village looked different in every season, and how sometimes, on clear nights, she would count the stars until she fell asleep. The girl listened, her head resting on her arm, smiling every now and then even if she didn't understand all the words. Before sleeping, the orphan checked the girl's foot once more. It looked better now. The bleeding stopped and the swelling less. She wrapped it again, careful and gentle. The girl whispered something that sounded like a prayer before closing her eyes. The orphan lay beside her, watching the light fade from the lantern. A strange feeling filled her heart, something between peace and fear. She knew this couldn't last forever. Someone might find out. The villagers were always suspicious of anything they didn't understand. But for now, she didn't want to think about that. She only wanted this small, quiet moment to last, a moment where she wasn't alone, where someone finally needed her. The next morning, she woke to the sound of voices far away, men talking near the fields. She peeked through a crack in the barn wall. A few villagers were standing by the riverbank, pointing across the water. She couldn't hear clearly, but she caught words like smoke and camp and tribes. Her heart sank. She knew what that meant. People were talking again, spreading fear. They always did whenever they saw anything strange near the forest side. She went back inside quickly, trying not to show her worry. The girl was awake, sitting quietly, holding the necklace that matched the one she had given. "We can't go out today," the orphan whispered. "People are near." The girl nodded, though she didn't seem surprised. Maybe she already knew what fear looked like in other people's eyes. All day, they stayed hidden inside the barn. The orphan listened to the sounds outside, the creak of wagon wheels, the shouts of men, the barking of dogs. Every sound made her flinch. She knew if anyone found the girl, there would be trouble. That evening, when the sky turned gray and the wind grew colder, the girl spoke softly again. "I go home soon," she said. "When river low." The orphan looked at her with worry. "Your foot still hurts." The girl smiled faintly. "Better now, you strong help, I remember." The orphan didn't know what to say. The thought of the girl leaving made her chest tighten. She had spent most of her life being invisible, and now for the first time someone saw her. Someone smiled at her, shared food with her, trusted her. As night fell, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what would happen next, whether the girl would really be able to cross the river safely, whether someone would see her, whether the people on the other side were looking for her right now. Outside, the river shimmered under the moonlight. The orphan sat at the door of the barn, holding the necklace in her hand. She whispered softly to herself, "Please let her be safe." The wind carried the sound of the forest, leaves rustling, an owl calling, and far away, something like the echo of drums. The orphan listened closely. The sound faded, but the feeling stayed. She didn't know it yet, but that sound meant something. Something that would change everything by dawn. The wind carried a strange chill that morning. The orphan woke up before sunrise, her heart already uneasy, though she didn't know why. The air outside the barn felt heavier, and the river sounded louder than usual. She stepped outside quietly, hoping to fetch water before anyone in the village was awake. Mist floated above the grass like pale smoke. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the world felt half asleep. As she neared the river, she stopped suddenly. Across the water, a thin trail of smoke was rising from the forest. It wasn't much, just a faint gray line climbing toward the pink sky. But it made her heart skip. She stared at it for a long moment. The forest was still, silent except for the distant call of birds. Then, somewhere behind her, a dog barked. She turned and saw two men from the village walking toward the river, talking quietly to each other. She quickly crouched behind a bush, trying to stay hidden. "See that smoke?" one of them said. "It's from across the river again." The other man nodded. "Probably their people, maybe moving closer." The orphan's stomach tightened. She knew what "their people" meant. The villagers had always been nervous about the tribes that lived beyond the forest. Some said they traded peacefully long ago. Others whispered stories about raids and missing cattle. No one really knew the truth, but fear was always louder than reason. The men stood by the riverbank for a while, their faces serious. "If they're crossing again, we'll have trouble," one muttered. The other kicked at the dirt. "We should tell the others. Better to be ready." They turned and walked back toward the village, their voices fading with the wind. The orphan stayed crouched for a while, her heart thudding fast. Then she ran back to the barn as quickly as her feet could carry her. Inside, the girl was sitting up, brushing her long hair with her fingers. When she saw the orphan's worried face, she frowned softly. "What happened?" she asked, her voice quiet. The orphan took a breath. "People saw smoke. They're talking again. They might come here." The girl's eyes darkened. She looked down at her foot. It had healed enough for her to stand now, though she still limped slightly. "I go soon," she whispered. "I not make trouble?" "No," the orphan said quickly. "You can't go yet. The river's too cold and deep. It's dangerous." The girl looked toward the cracks in the wooden wall where faint light spilled in. "They find me. she said. If they find, they hurt. The orphan shook her head. No one will find you, I'll keep watch. She meant it. She would protect the girl no matter what it took. That day the village was restless. The baker spoke in worried tones when the orphan came to sweep his shop. The blacksmith's wife whispered about tracks near the woods. Some people claimed they heard drums during the night. Fear spread like a shadow, and with it came suspicion. By afternoon, the orphan noticed two boys following her when she went toward the fields. They were younger than her, but bold, curious about why she always carried food and disappeared by the river. When she turned suddenly, they pretended to chase each other, laughing loudly, but she knew they were watching. Her heart sank. If they followed her again, they'd find the barn. That evening, the sky turned dark faster than usual. Clouds rolled in, heavy and gray. The air smelled like rain. The orphan returned to the barn with only a small piece of bread and a few berries. She was breathing hard from running the long way to avoid being seen. The girl looked at her with concern. "You tired?" she said softly. The orphan forced a small smile. "I'm fine, just hungry." They ate quietly, listening to the first drops of rain tapping on the roof. The sound grew louder until it became a steady rhythm. The barn was dry, but the wind pushed through the gaps, making the lantern flicker. The girl pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My people," she said slowly, pointing toward the forest. "They look for me." The orphan looked up. "They're looking for you?" The girl nodded. "I fall. I hurt foot. They wait, but I not come back. They think river take me." Her voice trembled slightly, as if the thought of it pained her. The orphan felt a lump in her throat. "They must be worried." "Yes," the girl whispered. "They come close now. They not want fight. Only find me." The orphan stared at her, realization sinking in. The smoke she had seen that morning. It wasn't a threat. It was a sign. Her people were searching for her. She sat in silence for a long time, the rain pattering on the roof. But then she remembered the villagers' words, their fear. They wouldn't believe this. They'd think the worst. If they saw the girl, they'd say she was a spy or worse. "We have to be careful," the orphan said. "They won't understand. The people in the village, and they don't trust anyone from across the river." The girl nodded sadly. "I know, but I go soon. Maybe tomorrow." The orphan didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, feeling the weight of something she couldn't control pressing down on her chest. That night, neither of them slept much. The rain stopped after midnight, but the wind howled through the cracks, making the barn groan. The orphan sat up most of the night, staring at the small necklace the girl had given her, wondering what tomorrow might bring. When morning came, the world was washed clean. The grass sparkled with dew, and the river glimmered like glass. But the peace didn't last long. Before noon, the orphan noticed a movement near the path. 3 men walking slowly toward the river, their dogs sniffing the ground. One of the boys from yesterday followed behind them, pointing toward the fields. Her heart sank. They were searching. She rushed back inside the barn. "They're coming," she whispered urgently. "We have to hide." The girl stood quickly, her limp making it hard to move fast. The orphan helped her to a dark corner behind a pile of hay. "Stay here," she said. "Don't make a sound." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear. A few minutes later, footsteps crunched outside. The orphan stepped out of the barn, pretending to be gathering sticks. One of the men stopped when he saw her. "What are you doing here, girl?" he asked gruffly. "Just picking wood for the fire," she said quietly, keeping her eyes down. The man looked around. "You come here often?" She shook her head. "Sometimes. It's quiet here." Another man peered inside the barn. "You sure you're alone?" The orphan's heart pounded so loud she was sure they could hear it. "Yes," she said softly. "No one comes here. It's old." The men looked around for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Keep away from the river, girl," one of them said. "It's not safe. There might be trouble." She nodded quickly. "I will." When they finally walked away, she waited until their voices faded before running back inside. The girl was still crouched behind the hay, trembling slightly. "They're gone," the orphan whispered. The girl let out a shaky breath. "They think bad things," she said softly. The orphan nodded. "Yes, but you're safe now." The girl smiled faintly, her eyes shining with tears. "You brave," she whispered. That night, the orphan helped her friend prepare for the journey home. The girl's foot was stronger now, though she still limped. The orphan found an old scarf to wrap around it for protection. The girl touched her hand gently. "You come?" she asked. The orphan looked toward the dark river outside. "I can't," she said sadly. "They'll know I'm gone, they'll come looking." The girl looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I remember you," she said softly. "You help me when no one help." The orphan smiled through the ache in her chest. "You don't have to thank me." Before sleeping, they sat together one last time, watching the moonlight spill through the cracks in the wood. The forest looked peaceful from afar, like a dark ocean under silver light. The girl told her a few words from her language, simple things like how to say friend and thank you. The orphan tried to repeat them, making the girl laugh quietly. In the silence that followed, both of them knew this was their last night together. The orphan lay awake long after the girl fell asleep. Her heart was heavy, but deep inside she knew she'd done the right thing. Tomorrow the girl would go home. And even if no one ever knew what she had done, it didn't matter. She would remember. She watched the girl's peaceful face and whispered, "Be safe." Outside, the river shimmered under the moon. Somewhere, in the distance, faint drums echoed again, slow, steady, and growing closer. The orphan didn't fear the sound this time. She understood now. It wasn't a warning. It was a call of love, a call of family searching for one of their own. She didn't know it yet, but by dawn, the whole village would hear that same sound, and everything would change forever. That night the moon hid behind clouds, and the air carried the sound of distant thunder. The little orphan sat quietly inside the barn, staring at the dim lantern. The light flickered across the rough walls, and she could hear the shallow breathing of the girl she had helped. The girl was sleeping, but every now and then she would wince from the pain in her foot. The orphan had done her best to wrap it with cloth, but it still looked bad. She wished she had herbs or medicine, but all she had was hope and a bit of courage. She sat beside her, holding the small piece of bread she had saved for dinner. She wasn't really hungry, but she knew the other girl would need it when she woke. The rain started outside, slow at first, then heavier. The wind slipped through the cracks of the old barn, making the wood creak. The orphan wrapped herself in her old shawl and tried to rest her head against the straw, but her heart kept pounding. Something didn't feel right tonight. Earlier that day, she had noticed a few villagers whispering near the well. They were talking about seeing strangers in the forest. One man said he saw a campfire far beyond the hills. Another claimed there were tracks near the river, footprints that didn't belong to anyone from the village. The orphan had kept her head down and pretended not to hear, but her hands trembled as she carried the bucket of water home. Now, as the rain fell harder, she looked at the sleeping girl and wondered what she should do. She couldn't let the villagers find her here. If they did, they might think the worst. People were quick to fear what they didn't understand, and fear often made them cruel. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the silence. A knock, faint but real. The orphan froze. Her eyes darted to the door. She blew out the lantern and held her breath. The barn went dark, lit only by the silver light of the moon peeking through a hole in the roof. Another knock, louder this time. Then a man's voice called out, rough and uncertain, "Is someone in there?" The orphan's chest tightened. It was the voice of one of the villagers, a man who often came to buy milk from the nearby farm. He was kind to some, but not to everyone. She stayed still, hoping he'd go away. But then she heard footsteps coming closer. The wooden door creaked open and a flash of lightning lit up the man's face. He held a lantern and looked around. His eyes landed on the orphan, then drifted to the girl lying in the corner. "What's this?" he said sharply, stepping inside. "Who's that?" The orphan stood in front of the girl, blocking his view. "She's hurt," she said quickly. "I was helping her. Please, she's not—" But he didn't let her finish. He turned and stormed out, his boots splashing through the mud. She knew where he was going. He was heading straight to the other villagers. The orphan dropped to her knees beside the sleeping girl and shook her gently. "Wake up," she whispered. "We have to go. They'll come soon." The girl's eyes fluttered open, still heavy with pain. "Go?" she whispered back, confused. "Yes. We must cross the river before they find us. It's not safe here." The native girl tried to sit up but winced, clutching her leg. The orphan slipped her arm around her and helped her stand. Together they stumbled to the door. The rain soaked them instantly. The cold bit through their skin, but neither stopped. The orphan knew every path, every broken fence, and every shortcut between the barn and the river. She moved as fast as her trembling legs allowed. The river came into view, dark and wild under the moonlight. The water looked rougher than usual, the rain feeding it until it swirled with white foam. The orphan hesitated. It looked dangerous, deeper than before. But there was no time to think. Behind them she could already hear voices shouting. Lanterns flickered in the distance. "Hold my hand," she told the girl. The native girl nodded weakly, and they stepped into the icy water. It was shockingly cold. The current pulled at their legs and the stones beneath were slippery. The orphan held tightly to the girl's arm, helping her move inch by inch. The water rose to their knees, then to their waists. The girl gasped as the cold struck her wound, but the orphan kept whispering, "Don't stop. Just a little more." A branch floated by and hit the orphan's shoulder, nearly knocking her off balance. She clung tighter to the girl, digging her feet into the mud. Each step felt heavier than the last. The river roared in her ears, drowning out everything else. Then, just as they reached the middle, a flash of lightning tore across the sky, and for a moment, she saw the opposite bank, so close yet still far. She pushed forward with all her strength, pulling the girl behind her. The water rose to her chest now. The girl slipped, crying out in pain. The orphan caught her before she went under, wrapping her arm around her waist. "Hold on to me," she yelled over the storm. Together, they stumbled forward until their feet touched shallower ground. When they finally reached the shore, they both collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping for air. The orphan lay on her back, rain hitting her face, her chest rising and falling fast. The girl turned to her, eyes full of tears. You saved me," she whispered. The orphan shook her head weakly. "You would have done the same." For a while they just sat there, catching their breath. The rain began to ease, the sky slowly turning gray as dawn neared. The forest on this side of the river was quiet, still wrapped in mist. The native girl sat up and untied a small string around her neck. From it hung a carved pendant made of bone, smooth and light. She took the orphan's hand and placed it in her palm. "This," she said softly, "belongs to my people. It means life given. You saved mine. Keep it." The orphan stared at the pendant, unsure what to say. "But it's yours." The girl shook her head gently. "Now it's yours too." The orphan closed her fingers around it. It felt warm, even in the cold rain. The girl looked toward the forest, then back at her. "I must go now. They will be looking for me. My father will send for me soon. But one day, maybe we'll meet again." The orphan wanted to stop her, to ask where she would go, but she understood it wasn't her choice to make. Some goodbyes didn't need words. The girl stood, limping slightly, and disappeared into the thick fog. The orphan stayed there for a long time, sitting by the river, watching the last ripples fade where they had crossed. The pendant rested in her hand, gleaming softly as the first light of morning broke through the clouds. Across the river, faint shouts echoed, the voices of the villagers. They had found the empty barn. The orphan knew she couldn't go back just yet, not until things calmed down. So she sat under the large willow tree near the river, pulling her knees close and wrapping herself in her shawl. The rain stopped completely, and the air smelled fresh, like the world had washed itself clean. She felt tired but peaceful, like she had done the right thing, even if no one would ever believe her. Hours passed before she finally made her way back to the edge of the village. People were gathered near the well, whispering again. Some pointed toward the forest, others looked frightened. She kept her head down and walked past them quietly, the pendant hidden in her pocket. Inside her small hut, she sat by the window, looking out at the fading mist. The world outside was waking up, birds singing, roosters crowing, and smoke rising from chimneys. Everything seemed normal again. But she knew something had changed, inside her and in the world beyond the river. That night she held the pendant close to her heart before falling asleep. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but a small voice inside told her that the story wasn't over yet. Because sometimes, one act of kindness doesn't end at the river's edge. It echoes, traveling farther than anyone could ever imagine. And by dawn, she would learn just how far it had gone. The morning came quietly, with the soft light of dawn brushing across the fields. Mist still hovered above the grass and the air felt cool and clean after the night's heavy rain. The orphan woke up to the sound of distant murmurs outside her hut. She rubbed her eyes and sat up slowly. Something was different. The village didn't sound normal. There was no laughter, no voices calling for morning chores, no usual chatter of children fetching water. Instead, there was a strange stillness. She stepped out into the cold air, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. A few villagers stood in the distance, pointing toward the open field that led to the edge of the forest. The orphan followed their gaze, and what she saw made her stop in her tracks. Across the misty clearing, standing in a line like shadows carved from the morning fog, were men on horseback, nearly 30 of them. Their presence filled the air with silence. They weren't shouting or moving. They simply stood there, tall and steady, their horses breathing clouds of mist into the cold air. The orphan's heart began to race. She recognized the way they held themselves, the markings on their clothing, and the feathers braided into their hair. These were native warriors, the same people the villagers had whispered about for days. For a moment, no one moved. The villagers hid behind fences and half-closed doors, whispering in fear. Some said it was an attack. Others said they had come for revenge. But the orphan didn't feel fear. Somehow, deep inside, she knew they hadn't come to harm anyone. One of the warriors, taller than the rest, stepped forward. His horse moved slowly, its hooves sinking into the damp earth. He stopped a few feet from the village path, then dismounted. He looked around, not with anger, but with calm, searching eyes. The orphan felt something pull her forward. She took a few steps toward him while everyone else backed away. Her small figure moved through the mist, her bare feet brushing the wet grass. The villagers whispered her name in shock, but she didn't stop. The tall warrior watched her approach. When she finally stood before him, he lowered his head slightly as if in respect. "You are the one," he said in a steady, low voice. His English was careful but clear. "The one who helped my daughter." The orphan's eyes widened. "Your daughter?" He nodded once. "She was lost. The river nearly took her. You found her. You gave her life." The orphan blinked, speechless. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small pendant, the carved bone necklace the girl had given her. The moment the warrior saw it, his expression softened. He held out his hand not to take it, but as a gesture of thanks. "She told me," he said quietly. "A little girl with no name helped her cross the water when even grown men would have turned away. She said you gave her warmth and that you asked for nothing in return." The orphan's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. All she could do was nod slightly. The warrior turned to his men and spoke in his own language. They dismounted their horses and walked forward slowly, their faces calm and their hands open to show peace. Each one carried something: baskets, blankets, carved wooden figures, and bundles of food. They placed them gently on the ground in front of the orphan's hut. "For you," the tall warrior said, "our way to say thank you." The villagers, watching from a distance, began to whisper again. Some were shocked, others ashamed. Just yesterday, many of them had spoken harshly about the orphan. They had called her names, ignored her in the streets, and treated her like a burden. Yet now these strangers and the people they feared were honoring her. The orphan's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. The warrior smiled faintly. "Kindness is always special. It travels farther than you think." He looked around the quiet village, his gaze resting briefly on the hidden faces peeking from windows. Then he turned back to her. "My daughter is safe. She told me to tell you this, that the river remembers the brave, and so do we." For a long moment no one said a word. The air was still except for the soft snorting of horses and the distant chirping of birds waking up to the morning. The orphan held the pendant tightly in her hand. Then slowly the warrior lifted his arm, and all 30 men raised their hands in a silent gesture of respect. It wasn't loud or grand. just a quiet, powerful salute that spoke louder than words ever could. The orphan felt her eyes sting again. She nodded slightly, returning the gesture with trembling hands. After a few moments, the tall warrior mounted his horse again. He gave her one last look, a mix of pride and gratitude, and then turned to lead his people back toward the forest. The horses moved in unison, their hooves creating a rhythmic sound that faded into the distance. When they were gone, the village remained silent for a long time. Then slowly, people began to step out from their homes. The same man who had once chased her from the barn walked forward, looking down in shame. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I thought—" The orphan shook her head. "It's all right," she said softly. "You were afraid. But fear doesn't have to stay forever." He looked at her, unable to speak. Others gathered around, unsure what to say. The village elder, an old man with a white beard, finally spoke. "We owe you thanks," he said. "You did what none of us dared to do. You reached across fear." The orphan didn't know how to respond. She just looked at the gifts laid before her. Food, blankets, and handmade crafts. It was more than she had ever owned in her life. But what mattered more wasn't what she had received. It was the peace that now rested in the air. That day, the villagers helped her move the gifts into her small hut. For the first time, they spoke to her kindly. Children came by to look at the carved figures, and one little boy shyly offered her a flower from the field. The orphan smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, she sat outside her hut with the pendant still in her hand. The gold light of sunset reflected off its smooth surface, and she thought of the girl she had helped, the one who limped through the river, the one who smiled through pain. She wondered if they were looking at the same sky right now, miles apart but still connected by that moment in the river. As the sky turned pink and orange, the orphan whispered softly, "Thank you for finding me too." For in helping someone else, she had also saved herself from loneliness, from doubt, from the quiet ache of being unseen. From that day forward, people in the village began to treat her differently. They no longer called her the orphan girl. They called her the girl from the river. When someone was hurt, they went to her first for help. When the children wanted to hear a story, they came to her hut. And when travelers passed by, they often asked, "Is it true what they say, that the river once brought peace because of one small girl?" And the villagers would smile and nod, pointing toward the small hut near the hill, where the girl still lived with her shawl, her warm smile, and a pendant that never left her side. Years later, long after the river had changed its course and the village had grown larger, people still spoke of that morning. They said the mist had carried the sound of hooves like a heartbeat, and that the girl who stood unafraid in front of 30 warriors had shown everyone the strength of a pure heart. The story spread far beyond the village. Travelers told it to strangers in other towns, and soon it became a tale passed down through generations. The story of how a little orphan helped a lost girl and brought peace to two worlds that once feared each other. But for the orphan, it was never about fame or glory. It was about the simple truth she had learned that day by the river, that kindness can cross any boundary, even one made of water and fear. Every dawn, she would still go to the riverbank, kneel by the water, and watch the ripples move away into the distance. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, she swore she could hear faint voices from across the forest. Laughter, soft and familiar, and when that happened, she smiled, knowing that somewhere beyond the trees, a girl with a healed foot and a kind heart was smiling too. Because some friendships are written not in words but in actions. And some stories are the truest ones, begin with a single moment of courage that never ends.